I had three really good friends, and their names were Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy. Every summer our parents would take us on a vacation. We always stayed in a remote cabin in the forest of Minnesota. The cabin was located on a large island in the middle of Lake Vermilion. Eventually, when we were old enough, our parents let us go to the cabin on our own for the first time. When we got there, we parked the car on the gravel road beside the lake. Then we had to take a boat across the lake about half a mile to reach the cabin. There were a few other cabins on the island, but they were all at least half a mile away. The cabin was quite small and only had a kitchen, a bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. At night, it was pitch black. There were no street lights for miles, and the only light came from the moon. There were no curtains on the windows, so when you were sleeping at night, you could see the moon shining down on the trees and the lake outside. On the 3rd night of our trip, we set up a campfire by the edge of the lake. The moon was full and a pale white glow was shimmering across the lake. We were gazing up at the stars when all of a sudden we heard a splashing sound, as if something was moving about in the water. Ryan suddenly stood up and pointed, saying, "What the hell is that?" We all looked in the direction he was pointing, peering into the darkness. After a while, I could make out he was pointing at. I'll never forget the feeling of terror that came over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and goosebumps appeared on my arms. I was paralyzed in fear. Out in the middle of the lake, there was a woman's head. It was just floating there on the surface of the water, staring directly at us. She had pale white skin and long black hair. Her hair was matted to her face. The rest of her was submerged or not even there. We tried to tell ourselves that it was just a loon. They are black and white birds that hunt at night, diving deep into the water. It didn't look like a loon, but that's what we tried to convince ourselves it was. We threw some more wood on the fire and tried to forget about it, but it still gave me the creeps. About an hour later, I had to go to the toilet, so I walked down to the edge of the dock and peed into the lake. Looking out over the moonlit lake, I noticed the thing was still there, but now it was much closer. It still looked like the woman's head, and it still seemed to be staring right at me. Its face was still extremely pale, as if it hadn't been out in the sun for years, and I could easily make out some facial features, the eyes and the nose. A feeling of incredible unease came over me as I realized it couldn't be a loon. There was no way a loon could just tread water for that long. There were no ripples around it either. It wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, stiff as a board, submerged in the water. I immediately zipped up my pants and ran back up to the dock to where my friends were, sitting around the campfire. I told them what I'd seen, but none of them dared to go down to the dock to take a closer look. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a log or a tree branch, just floating out in the water. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. None of us really believed that. We went back into the cabin and we shut the door, locking it behind us. It was very late and we just needed sleep. None of us mentioned a thing in the lake. We were all trying to avoid talking about it, honestly. There were no curtains on the windows, and I was getting ready for bed. I couldn't help but taking one last look. Peering out of the window, I could see the lake clearly, illuminated by the full moon. But the thing wasn't there anymore. It had completely vanished. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking it was a log that just floated away, or else it sank below the surface. Or perhaps it had been a loon, and it finally flown away. It was very hot that night, and we had to sleep with the windows open. My friend Tommy and I slept in one bedroom, and my 2 other friends slept in the other. We left our bedroom doors open. I was finding it hard to sleep, very, very hard. It was the middle of the summer and there wasn't even a slight breeze. The heat was stifling. As I lay there, I thought I could hear someone walking around outside the cabin. I kept my eyes tightly shut and tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. It sounded like someone with bare, wet feet pacing back and forth. I was trembling with fear, but I felt so weak I couldn't move. The footsteps, they sounded like they were walking up the steps to the cabin door. I wanted to shout out to my friends, but I was frozen in terror. Then the footsteps turned around and sounded like they were running down the steps and toward the lake. After a while, the footsteps faded away, and there was only silence. I reached over and shook my friend Tommy. He was already awake and he claimed he had heard the footsteps as well. Just then, I was startled to see Ryan coming running into our room. When he stepped into the moonlight, I could see his face, and the expression on it was very, very disturbing. He told us we need to leave. I asked why. What did you hear? He said, let's just go. He insisted. Let's get to the boat and it's time to go. He wouldn't answer. He just ran back into his room. We followed him and found Kevin sitting on his bed, already packing up his things. Ryan was running around frantically grabbing his stuff and stuffing it into a bag. What's wrong? I demanded. Ryan, what the hell is wrong with you? Tell us. He just stopped in his tracks and stared at me. There was a haunted look in his eyes. I would never forget what he said. He told us he was turning over in his bed to get more comfortable when he suddenly saw at the top right corner of his window, someone was peeking in. As soon as he set his eyes on it, the face vanished. He said all he saw was long black hair hanging down the window, ghostly white skin, and one large eye staring at him. When he said that, it chilled us to the bone. We realized that if the face was in the top right corner of the window, that meant the thing had to be damn near 8 feet tall, or else floating in midair. I felt like I was going to be sick. Let's just go now. We all agreed and packed our stuff up as quickly as we could. We grabbed our bags and ran out of the cabin, locking the door behind us. As we scrambled down the front steps, I glanced to the side and I saw footprints, bare, wet footprints, in the dirt all around the cabin. We ran down to the boat and threw our stuff in. We untied the boat from the dock and we sped off. I looked back over my shoulder and stared at the island, but I didn't see anything moving. However, I had the strangest feeling that someone or something was watching us. When we finally reached the other side of the lake, we tied up the boat, stuffed our backpacks in the car, and drove off. We had been driving for about 10 minutes when, out of the blue, Ryan suddenly broke down sobbing. He kept saying over and over, "What was it, guys? What was it? What did we see?" On the way, we called our parents to tell them what happened. Ryan was freaking out, and we didn't know what to do. They told us to just get home safely and quickly. My friend's dad went up to the cabin a few days later and said he saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, he did mention that there were bare, wet footprints all around the cabin, which he thought was odd. Whatever Ryan saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping and ended up having to go into therapy. They gave him some pills to calm him down and allow him to get a decent night's sleep. As time went on, he recovered and ended up being fine. But to this day, he still can't sleep unless the curtains on his window are completely shut. To this day, I still cannot explain what we saw in the lake that night. I never went back to the cabin. Tommy and Kevin had both gone back and everything was fine. But Ryan refuses to go back, and frankly, I'm with him on this one.
I was roughly 19 years old when this story occurred. I'm a tall male around 6'1", and I was living with my parents at the time. For reference, I live in a fairly condensed region of my country, and luckily for me, I live on the more lavish side of town in a rather large house. However, due to where I am, burglaries and home invasions are not a rare occasion, and I knew at some point it would happen to me, but that didn't make it any less petrifying. My parents wanted to have a romantic weekend away as their jobs have kept them very busy and they felt very much stressed. I gladly obliged as I wished to have the house to myself so I could play games until my eyes went square. They gave me about 50 euros for food and essentials and quickly sped off to the awaiting taxi. The rest of the afternoon went fairly quickly, and a couple of hours passed and I'm on my PC with a couple of my mates. I looked over at my bedside table and my dated alarm clock read 1 a.m. I slowly rubbed my eyes and I decided I was too tired to continue playing my games. I told my mates that I was heading off and pressed the power button, listening out for the final sound of the whirring fan to die out. I headed downstairs to get a glass of water, but then as I was grabbing the glass, I heard a slow, inconsistent tapping over at my window. This obviously confused me as it was so sudden, but the area I live in is known for foxes to try and get in to get food, so I checked the door, it was locked, and headed upstairs. The tapping eventually stopped, and I sighed a long sigh of relief as the sound was beginning to aggravate me. I was lying in my bed, trying to get to sleep, but roughly half an hour later I was awoken to the same scratching sounds. But this time, it was at my window. Now, I've read enough horror stories and creepypastas to know looking out my curtain was a horrendously horrible idea. However, this was bugging me, so I crept over to my curtain and slowly pulled it back, dreading what was on the other side. My stomach lifted as I was greeted with nothing, but at the same time I closed them, I heard the shatter of glass in the kitchen. I was terrified. I heard the sound of thick, heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. I snapped out of my frozen state and quickly closed and locked my door just as whatever was in my house got to the landing. I rummaged through my drawer for something to defend myself with. I unearthed an old Swiss Army knife that my dad gave me when I joined the Scouts years ago. All this time, this person is kicking at my door. I picked up the knife and jumped into my closet. Not too long after, I hear the sound of my door finally giving up and letting this person in. I looked through the gap. I saw a rugged man standing in my room, virtually foaming at the mouth with a rage that I had never seen before. His eyes were bloodshot, a deep crimson, and he was throwing my things, searching for me. I knew I had to act. I finalized on the idea that if this psycho came to my closet, I was going to stab him. He came over to my closet, and I knew the inevitable was going to happen. He pulled open my closet door, and I was greeted with this man who had menace in his eyes. I took no chances and plunged my blade into his chest, penetrating through his bone, letting out a blood-curdling scream before collapsing to the floor. I ran so fast out of my house, I got carpet burn along the bottom of my feet. I rushed to my neighbors as quickly as I could and explained to them the situation, and they called the cops. I stood outside my house as they dragged the ragged man out. Needless to say, I stayed at my neighbor's house, as all this insanity was sorted out.
For some context, I'm a 25-year-old female and I've been working at my city's hospital for transport for the past couple of years. It can be a chill and sometimes difficult job, but it begins to grow on you over time the longer you work. I work the night shift, so it's not too common for the department I worked for to be packed. I liked working the late shifts as they were mostly slow and much more relaxed. For most nights, you'd have some patients come in for something minor like physical pain or breathing problems. If we got patients who had severe problems like a broken leg or internal bleeding, we'd have to take them to urgent care or the ER. In fact, some can't even make it into the city, so we'd sometimes have the emergency stars helicopter have to drop in once in a while. I've seen some pretty intense things in my whole time working at the hospital. Everything from patients having trouble breathing all the way to people going into a coma. This one particular night, however, I witnessed something I would never forget. It was a slow night as usual, and I was talking with my aide about a patient's chart when somebody walked in through the main doors. My aide had left to go check up on a patient, and I was the only one at the front desk. There was a man. He wore a black shirt, a pair of gym shorts, which didn't make sense as this was during the winter and it was freezing cold outside. He looked to be middle-aged, maybe in his mid-30s, but he looked like crap, almost homeless. Messy, unkempt hair, a torn shirt, and smelled like marijuana. His eyes were red and his face was pale, and he looked like he didn't even know what he was doing. The hospital was located in a not-so-great area of my city, so you'd have your occasional creeps come in once in a while. Most of the time, people like this will be high on something and complain about constant dizziness or fibromyalgia from the drugs. He mumbled to me that he had a, quote, very bad headache and couldn't control it. I could smell the alcohol in his breath, and as much as I wanted to kick him out, our policy stated that we must care for someone who comes in no matter what. Needless to say, I tell him to sit down in one of the chairs in the waiting area, which is right in front of the emergency room. As he turned around to walk toward the waiting area, I noticed something sticking out of his back pocket, and it only took me a few seconds to realize that it was a knife. I didn't want to make it seem like I noticed, and the only security guard that was supposed to be on duty was on his break. The guy then started making strange noises while fidgeting and talking to himself. I had my eyes practically glued to him, and I was just hoping one of my coworkers would come out and call the police as I couldn't page anyone. This guy was big and tall, so there was no way I could fight him off even if I tried. Thankfully, the aide who was working with me had came out and I texted him the whole ordeal. With a shocked look, he steps outside and calls the police, and they thankfully arrive within 5 minutes and arrest the man. The man tried to resist, but it didn't work as he was completely wasted. Now this is the part that still freaks me out. Apparently, an hour before he had came in, he had stabbed somebody in the pelvis working at a gas station. Police had told us that this guy was arrested before for sexual assault and battery. He was charged and was put in jail for 15 years, which in my opinion got the crime. I still work in the same hospital, and nothing has happened ever since.